All right, fantastic. Well, today we're talking about Towers Hall Revisited. We've got three big anniversaries coming up next year, and they are the 175th anniversary of Otterbein's founding. They are the 50th anniversary of the Courtright Memorial Library, and they are the 150th anniversary of the dedication of Towers Hall. This is, of course, the crown jewel of campus, our beautiful Victorian Gothic structure that is the oldest structure on campus and is really the heart and the soul of campus. So let's go back in time and talk a little bit about how it came to be. Otterbein University was founded in 1847 by the United Brethren Church. We were the very first school to be established by that church, and we were founded on the site of a former Methodist seminary. According to legend, one of our founding fathers, a gentleman named Lewis Davis, just happened to be in a hat shop in Columbus, Ohio in 1846, and he overheard two gentlemen from Westerville talking about this property they were trying to sell. It consisted of two buildings and some acreage, and they were desperate to try and offload it. At that time, Lewis Davis was trying to find the perfect place to establish a new school. They wanted something that was located close enough to a major city to have the amenities of the city, but far enough away from that city so that the dangers and the evils of the big city life would be far removed from the students. Westerville, Ohio at that time was perfect. So Davis went back to the Conference of the United Brethren. They gave them the go-ahead. And on April the 26th of 1847, the first meeting of the Executive Committee, which today we would call the Board of Trustees, met in this structure over here. Can everyone see my cursor moving around on the image? Give me a thumbs up if you can, please. Perfect. This white frame chapel and this red brick dormitory were the first two buildings in which Otterbein University opened. Now, we were a poor school, probably because we were founded by a poor church. So it took us a while before things started to grow and we had the ability to expand. Our very next building was over here across Main Street. This basically is sat where the front lawn of the library is today, and it was called Psalm Hall. It was another dormitory. After that was successfully funded and constructed, it was decided that it was time to build a big main building that would have all the amenities that they needed, rooms for the literary societies, a proper library, and a chapel large enough to take care of all the functions of the school, as well as to serve the United Brethren congregation, which had grown up around Otterbein since its founding. Work began in 1856, but again, being a poor school, work did not progress very quickly. Now, the building was occupied, we think about 1861, but it was never completely finished. On the night of January 26, 1870, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the main building caught fire. It was completely destroyed. Within a matter of hours, this is all that remained of the university's building. At 4 o'clock in the morning, literally across the street from the smoldering ruins in the home of then President Lewis Davis, the faculty came together, held a meeting, and decided that they were going to continue the work of the university. Now the question became for the Board of Trustees, does the university rebuild here in Westerville, or does it move elsewhere? I should mention that the church headquarters at this point was located in Dayton, Ohio, and there was a large faction of people who thought it made sense to have the university move to Dayton to be very close to the rest of the church activities. However, bids were put out, so to speak. Dayton came up with, we will give you X amount of dollars to secure land near or around us and money to build. Westerville really wanted the school to stay here, so they brought forward their own proposal and say, we'll give you this much to stay put. After some debate, the Board of Trustees decided that they would stay in Westerville and rebuild, bigger and better. Architect R.T. Brooks of Columbus was hired to do the design, and A.W. Cornell of Newark was hired to build the structure at a much faster pace than the last building. Brooks is best known today for designing Schiller Park down in German Village. And if you know your Columbus history, he designed the original City Hall, which sadly burned down back in the 19th century. But when you see photos of that, you see a lot of similarities between it and Towers Hall. Originally, the building was going to be dedicated in August of 1871. In fact, they had pushed commencement back to August of 1871 because they wanted to do everything together. However, the building wasn't quite ready yet to dedicate, and they felt that it needed to be complete before the official dedication. So it would take one more year until June 2nd of 1872 when, don't know my own strength. It would be June 2nd of 1872 before the building was dedicated. Thanks to Sarah Ross, who has been doing some work with us this year, we managed to find the review from the Religious Telescope, which was the United Brethren Church newspaper, of the day itself. Quote, "Thursday, commencement day, was the great day of the feast. The citizens of Westerville put on their holiday attire, and those from the country came flocking in. Anxious parents were there to witness the graduation of their sons and daughters. One good father, who had never heard his son speak in public, was painfully anxious after hearing the others, lest John should fail. But John did not fail. After the addresses from the graduating class, President Eberly delivered a short but fine address on the benefits of mental culture, after which came the conferring of degrees upon the members of the class and the delivering of diplomas. In the afternoon, the dedicatory services of the new college building took place, conducted by Bishop J.J. Glossbrenner. After brief and stirring addresses by Reverend Z. Warner and Bishop Glossbrenner, the bishop gave the building to the triune God in a dedicatory prayer to be used in the interest of science and religion. The exercises of the day closed with a fine musical concert given to the graduation class." End of quote. I find it interesting that they specified the building was to be used in the interest of science and religion, with science being first. I think it shows that the United Brethren were very open-minded in their beliefs and in the importance or where they placed science. Before we leave this photo, I just want to point out, do you notice on the South Tower, the two men standing at the very top? It is possible to get into that tower, although I don't know how you'd get all the way to the top of it. Of course, officially, the archivist would never let students go upstairs with him to do research and then pop into that tower. No, that never happened whatsoever, and I certainly don't have photographs to prove it. Anyway, let's talk about the inside of the building. Here you see the YMCA classroom. I love this photo because it shows you how the building was heated back in its early life. These beautiful freestanding stoves. Also notice the chandeliers. These would have been gas lanterns into the early 20th century. So how did the coal get up to the classrooms? Well, today, if you visit the basement, you may see what looks like two boarded up windows, but these are actually the openings for the dumbwaiters that used to bring the coal from the basement up to the various levels of the building to heat it. According to the great Dr. Harold Hancock, who was Otterbein historian for many years, the last time these were opened up, there were still bits of splintered furniture at the bottom, because apparently one of the pranks that was played back in the day was the chapel space, which we're going to see in a bit, was emptied of all of its pews, and they were all stuffed into these old coal chutes, and some of them didn't quite make it back out intact. Ah, the chapel, isn't it beautiful? This was one of the most important features of the building for its early life. This housed daily chapel services for almost 75 years, and it housed the United Brethren church services on Sunday until their sanctuary was built across the street in 1916. In addition, the chapel was the home of many important events. For instance, William Hanby's funeral. The bishop, who was Father William Hanby, His funeral was held there, and his body actually lay in state, as they say, outside of Towers prior to his service. Here's another shot. The faculty sat at the very front on the first floor. And interestingly, they were surrounded by the juniors and seniors. Now, at the time, the juniors and seniors wanted to be closer to the faculty to soak up some of the reflective glory, we think, and they banished the sophomores and freshmen to the top balcony there. I suspect today these seniors and juniors would insist on sitting in the balcony to be as far away from the faculty as possible. Also of note, in the very early years, the chapel was divided in half, and the men sat on one side and the ladies on the other side. Now, as far as I can tell, this room is in the southwest corner of Towers on the far south wing. It was Dr. McFadden's science cabinet, as they called it. Dr. Thomas McFadden was a local physician who, in the ways of Otterbein, was slowly drawn into the university. Hey, would you mind being secretary for the board of trustees? Hey, would you mind teaching a science class or two? How about you take over the entire science department? McFadden deserves his own program, but for our purposes, I just want to mention that a lot of the equipment you see in this photo, he built himself. The university allowed him to go to Europe after the Civil War to purchase modern scientific equipment for the university. But when he got there, he found that a lot of it was overpriced, way too expensive for their budget, and that he could go home and fabricate most of it for a fraction of the cost. So that's what he did. One other thing in this photograph, back in the corner here, you see a telescope. That was one of the telescopes owned by math professor John Haywood. Haywood's another one of those characters who deserves his own program, but he was an amateur astronomer who observed the transit of Venus, took weather notes, and was one of the first mayors of Westerville. That telescope still exists and is held today in the science department. I'm hoping to borrow it for a display here in the library next year. The literary societies. In the 19th century, there wasn't a lot of social outlet for the students. Literary societies were very important. These were groups that came together to share a love of learning, a love of literature, of the fine arts, and it gave them, the students, a chance to put what they were learning in terms of debate, rhetoric, and other literary efforts into use. It was very, very desirous to be a part of these societies. Everybody wanted in, but not everyone made it. The first literary society was for everyone. It was called the Lyceum, founded by our favorite son, Ben Hanby, but then later on it broke into 4 distinct groups. The Philomathian Literary Society, which we all know as the one room that has come through to us today, looked like this in the 19th century. Next door was the Philophronian Literary Society. The detailing that you see on the wall in this photo, all painted. The French trompe-l'oeil, if I'm saying that correctly, which I probably am not, but to fool the eye is what it translates as. I should point out that the furniture you see in these rooms, and the rugs, and the decorations, the chandeliers, they were all paid for by members of the society. The university just gave them empty rooms in Towers and said, it's up to you to do with them as you see fit. Again, Otterbein not having a lot of money to spare. Apparently, though, the literary societies did quite well by raising funds, because you can see the opulence here in these rooms. If you move across the hall to the ladies' literary societies, the Philolethian Hall was right across from the Philomathian room. We still have a couple of those chairs that you see here in the archive, as well as the officers' chairs. And then next door to that was Cleridian Hall. This was the last of the ladies' literary societies. For many years, there was just one. And in 1871, right before Towers was occupied, this new society formed. It's not the best photo, but I like it because it shows you this square, grand piano, very common in the Victorian era. We actually have that piano down here in the archive. For many years, it lived in the Philomathian room, And today it is here where I hope at some point to get some funding to maybe fix it up and put it on display. Moving down to the second floor, we come to the very first library in Towers Hall. It was not a library like we think of it today. It was just opened a few hours each day during the week, no weekend hours. And the men and the women in the early days had separate hours. Obviously, by the time this photo was taken, which we think was about 1900, the men and the women were allowed to come together to study. The gentleman seated at the center of the table with the mustache, that is Professor George Scott, Latin professor, also a one-time president of the university. He was the first person to sit down and catalog all of our books and magazines in that brand new system, the Dewey Decimal System. He kind of ran the library as a sideline until we actually hired our first librarian, Tirzah Barnes. And of course, they both continued to work in the library until it grew too large that it had to move out of the building. Well, we'll talk about that in a bit. Down to the first floor, I believe that this is the southeast corner of the south wing of Towers. This, of course, is Dr. Snavely's classroom, looking probably around 1904, 1905. In those days, the professors didn't have offices. They simply had a classroom that was theirs to use to teach their subjects. And as you can see, Dr. Snavely taught history. Notice the decorations. We have, of course, our first president, George Washington, hanging on the wall. And we date this because this must have been the current president, Theodore Roosevelt. For those of you who are politically minded, Westerville has always traditionally been a Republican town, but Snavely was a rare Democrat. And he was also one of the last mayors of the town before Westerville switched to the city manager style of governance. Before Lambert Hall, before the Battelle Fine Arts Center, art classes were held in Towers. I don't really know where this classroom was located, but what I can tell you is that art started more of an extracurricular program like music did. However, over time, professors such as Leonie Scott, who you see here in the back, and others brought together a curriculum that focused on art history and art styles, as well as the actual teaching of painting, sculpture, etc. And so they led to art becoming a part of the regular curriculum. And I just love this photo. This is the Philomathian room as we know it, or as it's closer to what we know today. This was a 1905 renovation. My researcher and volunteer, Don Foster, has been doing a lot of work on architect Frank Packard, and he believes that this may have been a Frank Packard design. The literary societies didn't really last long into the 20th century, unfortunately. The societies were conducted according to the rules of parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order. And they fine you for everything you did wrong. Show up late, that's a fine. You miss a meeting, it's a fine. You speak out of turn, it's a fine. If you don't do the hand signal correctly, it's a fine. I assume that's how they got so much money, was they kept fining everybody. A lot of the students wanted something a little more relaxed going into the early 20th century. And so the guys who were in supper clubs together or who roomed together unofficially began to form Greek organizations. And the ladies followed suit soon after. Of course, these were underground for many years. It wasn't until the 1920s that they were actually allowed to form as social clubs. No Greek life. They were just social clubs. That's why all of Otterbine's fraternities and sororities have their nicknames. You know, you couldn't be Pi Beta Sigma in 1920, but you could be the Annex Club. You couldn't be Sigma Alpha Tau, but you could be the Owls Club. And I apologize for not name checking everybody, but I'm going with the two older ones. So it wasn't until the 1930s when all pretense lifted and things became Greek societies. By the 1930s, the men's literary societies had all vanished, and it wasn't much longer before the ladies' societies closed up shop. Over the years, then, the rooms changed purposes, but we will get to that in a bit. You can't talk about Towers Hall without talking about pranks. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographic evidence of the many cows that were led up the stairs in Towers and left on the third floor. You may not know this, but it's very easy to get a cow to climb steps, but it is physically impossible, based on how their knees are made, to get them to go downstairs. So you either had to carry them down the stairs in Towers, which at the time were circular wooden stairs, or more likely, you figured out how to open up one of the windows and get a crane to lower them down to the floor. Other animals that have made their way into Towers include chickens. Occasionally, a professor would open a drawer and out would pop a chicken. We have seen outhouses show up in Towers Hall with signs like treasurer on them. This one is a very specific prank. At the turn of the last century, we had just hired a new president, and he made it known that he was looking for a new house to move into when he took up the office. So the students got together. They probably borrowed, I hope you see the air quotes, borrowed these bricks from the local brick mill and assembled a little house for him on the front lawn of Towers. Peeking out of the window, and you can't really see it in this photo, but also smoking a cigarette, was the science department's skeleton. Sometimes she's known as Aunt Sally, sometimes she is known by another name, which is, of course, escaping me now that I'm here on camera being recorded. Suffice to say, the skeleton also took part in a lot of pranks over the years. I love this photo because it gives you a chance to see what the building looked like before the construction of the Centennial Library. It may be one of only 2 or 3 images that exists of that. But it also leads us to the back lawn of Towers, which was important because that was our first athletic field. Back before Memorial Stadium, or even that plot of land, was graded and turned into a field, all of our sports activities took place back behind Towers. The eagle-eyed among you will notice the old association building here in the back corner where Roush Hall now stands. Others of you are probably looking at the fact that these are the guys wearing the old leather helmets, or no helmets at all. This was taken about 1911, which was the last year that the sports were played back here behind Towers. For those of you who are wondering, yes, we played the Ohio State University in football in our early years, and we beat them several times. I would also like to tell those of you who have obnoxious OSU friends who insist that you call it the Ohio State University, that Otterbein was founded as the Otterbein University of Ohio. So say that to them next time that they get uppity. About this time, the main building took on the name the Ad Building. We haven't gotten to the name Towers yet. It was called the Ad Building because all of the administrative offices were located here on the first floor of the building. This is what the president's waiting room looked like about 1913. His secretary would have sat here. If you were waiting to see him, you would have had a seat in one of these chairs with a great view out the front of the building. Here you see Dr. Walter G. Clippinger, our longest serving president, sitting at his office desk. Notice the very new modern technology of the telephone here installed behind his desk. Clippinger was the first modern president. He got the university out of debt. He began building the endowment. He was involved in setting the standards for higher education, a lot of which he either tried and worked out at Otterbein or came back and applied to the university, putting us at the forefront of higher education in Ohio. He established freshman orientation. He saw the school through World War I and the Great Depression, and he imported gray squirrels from Pennsylvania. I kid you not, we have the documentation. He felt, for whatever reason, that the common brown squirrels of Ohio were not robust enough for the town, and so to delight the masses, he actually bought gray squirrels, brought them to Westerville, and allowed them to take over. Those of you like me who wish we could have a garden but can't because the squirrels eat all the fruits and vegetables, have Dr. Clippinger to thank. Pardon my swearing. Can we edit that out? Excellent, thank you. I'm getting thumbs up. Otterbein continued to be a major seat of church and university events through 1916, when the Church of the Master was built. Most large functions after that moved to the sanctuary of the church, and so the chapel was used for other smaller events, things like concerts, not usually theater. When we did theatrical events, they tended to be either outdoors, like in a pageant setting, or we would simply go and borrow the high school gymnasium and stage to do that. But here you see the concert choir from the 16-17 school year. Oh, I'd like to point out in the background here, notice this plaque on the wall. That is a memorial to the missionaries who came from Otterbein University and went to Sierra Leone, West Africa. We have had a long-standing relationship with that country, and that plaque can now be seen hanging in the archive. Special events were held in the chapel through the early 1950s. Here you see a benefit dance. They were trying to raise money for some centennial projects. This one in particular was to raise money for a natatorium. I actually had to look that up. That was a word I did not know. It's just a fancy way of saying a building with a swimming pool in it. I have to point out in the background here, that's Lee Shaxson, who was head of the music department at the time. Sad to say that the university did not raise enough money for that swimming pool. There were two other projects that went along with the Centennial, the Memorial Stadium project. That one was fully funded because the returning veterans took that up as their cause. They wanted to do something to honor the 14 people who had died in service from Otterbein during World War II. So that's why our stadium was and is Memorial Stadium. The other projects, the natatorium, and then the Centennial Library. Our Carnegie Library building, which had been occupied in 1908, had taken over for the two rooms on the second floor of Towers. But now it had grown to the point where they needed more space. This is what we were going to build. It was going to be standing where Cowan Hall is today. Sadly, because we didn't get enough money for either the natatorium or this, what the school did was combine the pools of money and decided to revise the centennial plans just a little bit and make an addition onto the back of the main building, of the ad building. Sadly, this included raising the chapel. This was so that they could put in the floors to contain the stacks or the books of the library. It's one of those things where I look at it and think, yeah, I understand why they did it. They kind of had to at the time, but man, if I win the lottery, we're going to rebuild this thing. I would also mention in passing, if you want to see a chapel that looks somewhat like ours, go to Heidelberg University. The last time I was there, which admittedly has been a few years ago, but I don't think they would have removed it. They have a chapel that looks very similar to ours. I would say it was not nearly as fancy as ours, but it's a good idea of the sort of structure we had. The Centennial Library was opened in 1954. Here you see the reading room. Today, of course, we know this as two large classrooms, but at the time it was open from end to end. Notice the built into the wall card catalog. You had the reference shelves all along the back wall here, and the front desk was here. Now, I've heard different stories from different people, but as I understand it, this was a closed stack system, which meant you would find the book that you wanted in the card catalog, and then you would go to the student or the librarian on duty, and you would say, can you please bring me this book? Here's the call number. And then they would go back into the stacks, pull it, and bring it out to you so you could check it out. This was also the scene of one of the great pranks of the university. On senior night, the librarian at the time, John Becker, stayed up all night to make sure that nothing happened to the library. Probably about 6 in the morning, the student showed up and said, all right, you got us, we can't do anything. Can we at least walk you home? And so Mr. Becker agreed. They walked him home. He got a couple of hours sleep, returned to the library, and in his absence, they had taken all of the cutlery and glassware and plates and tablecloths from the campus center, brought it in and laid out all of these tables for breakfast. Before we leave the Centennial Library, I will mention that design elements from that original freestanding building, of course, made their way into the finished Centennial Library edition. Ah, how could I forget? The most important thing in the Centennial Library was the very first Otterbein archive, the Otterbein Room. You see, over the years, there had been attempts to tell Otterbein's history and to collect things, but really the archives didn't get going until librarian Mary Crumrine in the 1930s and 40s, and then later Dr. Robert Price of the English department came together and started gathering things out of attics and closets. And when people would clean out their offices, they say, hey, what have you got? And so everything was brought together and everything was organized by Dr. Price into the core collection of what we have in the archives. I sometimes look at my backlog and think Dr. Price is going to come back and haunt me. Oh, in passing, let me mention that Dr. Price was the world's leading expert on Johnny Appleseed, aka John Chapman. His book, Johnny Appleseed, Man and Myth, is still in print and is an excellent source of information on the subject. When the Centennial Library opened in 1954, that freed up the old Carnegie Library building. So all of the administrative offices moved out of Towers into the Carnegie building. It was rechristened Clippinger Hall, which is the name it has today, and it has served over the years as President's Office, Treasurer's Office, etc. Today, its primary function, of course, is for bringing in the new students and oh, I'm drawing a blank on the department's name. How embarrassing. Hopefully no one's watching. Anyway, so what do you call a building that's no longer the administration building? Well, the Board of Trustees said, we shall name this building Old Main. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? But nobody called it Old Main. Everybody knew what the building was. When you think about all of the ways in which the towers of this beautiful structure had been used over the years in branding and logos, and even the alumni newsletter was Towers Magazine, or just Towers. The students called it Towers Hall. And so the very next year, the Board of Trustees came back together and said, we shall christen this building Towers Hall. And the rest, as they say, is history. Here's what the student mailboxes looked like in the 1950s. A much simpler time, I would say, before the advent of Amazon boxes being delivered on a daily basis. Notice the old telephone sign there for the payphone. Also notice this curved wall in the background. Now, you young'uns who haven't been on campus for a while probably don't realize this is the back wall of the old chapel. And for many years, you could still see the curve on both the first and the second floor. Also, you will notice the two-tone paint job, which was there even when I was a student in the early 90s, which sadly is a lot longer ago than it used to be. Our radio station got its start on the third floor of Towers. It was what they called a carrier current radio station, which meant it literally turned all of the wiring in Towers into the antenna that broadcast the signal. We began life as WOBC radio. And, you know, that worked pretty well until there was that day when the guys at the station decided to crank the power. It had never been a very strong station under FCC guidelines, but that meant that nobody could hear it beyond city limits. So sometimes they'd crank the power so that they could be heard a little bit further away. They just happened to do this when a gentleman from the FCC was passing through town and his entire radio was blasting our station because of how much power they put to it. So unfortunately, we got our license revoked. Now, we would come back later, back a couple of years later, reestablished in the basement of the newly built Cowan Hall, and with the new call letters WOBN, which of course is what it has stayed to this day. Also on the third floor, we had the psychology department labs. They would run tests on various animals. Nothing that PETA would be upset about, but as you can see, they've got the maze set up. They've got the rats that they took care of. I also have it on good authority that at one point, Dr. Wells, who you see here on the right, had a monkey that lived there in Towers. Let's talk a little bit about Sanders Fry. He was the Otterbein business manager for many years in the mid-20th century. A remarkable engineer. He designed the pin setting device that is now seen in bowling alleys worldwide. He did this when he was working for the Levesque Corporation, which is a well-known Columbus institution. I am told that they did not have any patents with his name on it because they had been working together, Levesque and Fry, under a gentleman's agreement. And unfortunately, Levesque passed away before anything could get settled. So Fry is known as the inventor, but sadly, he didn't make much money off of it. I like to think that Otterbein was kind of his early retirement job from Levesque, and what he did on campus was amazing. He designed and built the original planetarium and observatory on top of the science building, as well as the old greenhouse that used to be on the side of the building. He took down the old power plant and brought in the new power plant that we are still using in part to this day to heat, cool, and power the university. And he did a lot of work in Towers. The basement floor, for example, was a dirt floor until Fry arrived and had everything leveled out. He also replaced the wooden stairs with fire retardant concrete stairs. Now, there's an interesting story about the staircases. The ones on the left here of your screen are not the original staircases. As I mentioned before, the original staircases in Towers were circular and made of wood. That's why when you look in the stairwells, you will notice that the windows all seem to be in wrong places and several of them are boarded up. Well, once upon a time, that was an open shaft from basement to third floor. These square wooden staircases, I don't know when exactly they went in, but obviously by the 1950s, it was one of those things where they were not really safe enough to handle the student load. And if something caught fire, they would be destroyed immediately, preventing anyone from escaping the building. So Fry put out to bid new staircases. And there was one company that came back way under every other estimate. They checked the paperwork, everything looked to be right, and so obviously we went with that company. Well, it turns out that the company was mistaken in what they thought the school wanted. So they only gave us an estimate for one staircase. But the company made good on its offer, and so we got two staircases for the price of one. Pay no attention to the extremely cute girl over there on the right side of your screen. That is my daughter, back before she decided that ponies are no longer cool. Did you know that Otterbein University was a pioneering institution in foreign language instruction? Anyone who has done foreign language learning with videos, watching people in various situations, talking the everyday conversational language, all of that originated here with the Rossolo family. Lavelle Rossolo, she pioneered this method, and she was the one who developed it, sold it to Encyclopedia Britannica, and from there it took off to be the dominant language studying guide for decades. Her father came to Otterbein around the turn of the 20th century. We are told that he arrived early before classes started. There was no one around, and so he basically spent the night in the basement of Towers his very first day on campus. But he taught history, he taught French. Obviously, with a name like Rossolo, you know that they had a family connection back to France. And it was his daughter who pioneered these methods, and the two of them went to France and actually filmed students and others conversing, and that's where all of this came from. The old language lab here in Towers allowed the students to work with both recordings and with instructors. They would speak back the language to them, and so they could converse and work on the language. Towers, of course, has needed a lot of maintenance over the years. The two big pushes were the 1970s and the 1990s. Here you see the North Tower being replaced in and around 1978. Here is the South Tower waiting to be lifted up onto the top of the building. At that time, they also cleaned and refurbished the bell that hangs in the North Tower. Here you get to see brick that probably hadn't been seen by human eyes in over 100 years and has not been seen since. They're working on the foundations, probably cleaning it or perhaps putting a coating of some sort of waterproofing on it. Ah, the data center. Originally, the data center at Otterbein began its life over in the basement of Cochrane Hall, the ladies' dormitory. Unfortunately, Cochrane Hall caught fire in 1976, and so they had to move everything over into Towers. Now, by 76, the library had moved out of Towers and was in the Courtright Memorial Library building. So the center area in the old chapel, where the books used to be, was turned into, among other things, the data center. Now, we tend to think these days of computers as being the little box on our desk that is plugged into the internet. In those days, we have instead what you might call dummy terminals that were hooked up to mainframes, the big monsters like you see in the old movies with the reels of tape on the side of them. Those all lived down at the Battelle Memorial Institute. And so while we had the terminals here, all of the real work in computing was done on those computers off-site and then sent back to us. Some of you old-timers may recognize Roger Wiley there of the Math and Computer Department. Here you see typical classroom in the 1980s, and the building is starting to show its age. This is really how I remember coming into Towers as a student, as a greener than green freshman in the fall of 1993. The paint was chipped, the wood was worn. All of those desks had so much graffiti on it, you could practically tell the history of Greek life just by looking at what had been carved into them. Notice the electric is still popped out of the walls. Nothing was set in because of the old style of the walls. Probably not the safest means of doing it. Towers really needed a facelift. So the university decided that in 1998, they were going to take the building offline, and they were going to spend approximately $4 million to renovate and restore the building, to bring it up to code, and to add things that were necessary for OSHA, for example, or for ADA compliance. We now had an elevator in Towers. I remember talking to Sylvia Vance, the former chair of the IS department, and she told me that she was always in shape because her office was on the third floor of Towers. So she took the stairs every day, up and down several times. But now we had an elevator. And more importantly, at least to folks like myself who were warned by alumni before I even arrived on campus, don't take classes in Towers in the summer, you will burn up. We now had air conditioning in Towers. The rededication ceremony took place on Founders Day in 1999. Prominent among the folks you see here are, let's see, this is Thomas Bromley, former board chairman. This is Bill LeMay, another former board chairman. There's Sylvia Vance, God bless her. Sylvia Vance is an interesting woman in Otterbein's history. In a time when there was no curve to any grading system, she broke the curve. She was arguably the student who had the highest GPA ever to go through Otterbein. I've always said she was and is the smartest person in whatever room that she stepped into. And when she returned to Otterbein, she taught French, but eventually became head of the new Integrative Studies department and was integral in its success. One other person to mention in this picture, of course, is Edwin Dubs Roush of Roush Everything fame, Roush Hall, Roush Honda, Roush Hardware, Roush Sporting Goods. Thanks to that man, Otterbein is very well taken care of. Now it's time for a little before and after. First floor before, how I remember this look. Here it is during the construction. and as it looks today. Obviously, Towers Hall never looked this good in the early days. As I had mentioned before, the United Brethren didn't have the funds to put in all of this extra wood paneling and the fancy lights, but thanks to the generosity of Otterbein friends and alumni, we were finally able to polish the crown jewel to perfection. See, here you see the classrooms in the old Centennial Library reading room. Man, I wish I was still that skinny. And even some of the Literary Society halls got an upgrade. Over the years, the Society halls have been used for various different things. Storage, classroom space, meeting space, offices. The Philophronian Hall became a dance studio. The Philalethian Hall was one that was converted into faculty offices. There are still some traces of the old Literary Society, the stained glass and the beautiful doors. And the one that I find most amusing is you can still see the baseboard and how it jumped up on the floor or the dais on which the officers of the society would sit. After the renovations were complete the following year, courtesy of Nationwide Insurance, Nationwide Plaza was created in front of Towers Hall. Before this, it was all grass and open trees up to the front doors, but this gave us a place where we could congregate, and classes could be held outside, concerts could be given, special events could be held, various activities. Poetry readings, teach-ins, and what I lovingly refer to as other hippie crap takes place in this space. It's humbling to know that occasionally you can make a mark on an institution, and I have to say I'm kind of proud in my involvement in this one. On the second floor of Towers Hall, the last remnant of the chapel remains, that curved wall that would have led into the balcony. In 2007, the university was planning its ways to celebrate outgoing President Brent DeVore, and I suggested a project that I'd had in my mind for a long time, a President's Gallery. Originally, I thought assemble portraits and do something like that, but working with IA and marketing, we came up with this wonderful idea of featuring each president in their own little mock window. Jokingly, these became referred to as the surfboards, even though obviously we're going for the Gothic window look. Each president gets their photo, each president gets their write-up. This came to us courtesy of Dr. Thomas Jefferson Kerr IV, former president. He had done a beautiful history of the presidents, and so he took his text, condensed it for the board. We found the photographs of everyone, we put it together, and I have to say we are quite pleased with the way it turned out. And I like to be able to say, you know, that's my fingerprint over there. That's something I was able to bring to campus, or help bring to campus. As you can see, the Philomathian Room continues to be used for concerts, for rehearsals, for classes, and for special events like a Harry Potter party. Just recently, in the summer of 2016, it was given a new look. This was meant to take it back to more of the Victorian style, which at the time was felt to be an appropriate use. It also brought technology into the room so that it would be easier to be used as a classroom space. And so today, if you go up to the third floor, this is what you will see. A lot of the original features remain: the woodwork, the rostrum, the chairs, the display case, all of that original to the society. And certain other elements from other rooms have been brought in too. The chandeliers were originally in the Philophronian room. I always like to close by saying the one thing that unites Otterbein students from 1871 up through the present is that we've all taken a class in or had something that we participated in that took place inside of Towers Hall. It is the symbol of the university, and it is the spiritual heart of the university. As the love song says, she stands serene mid treetops green.